Welcome to the Grace Story Podcast, where inspiring stories are brought to life. This podcast is made possible by Grace College and Seminary, located on the shores of Winona Lake in the great state of Indiana. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Flam. This is the Grace Story Podcast. Today, our guest on the podcast is Barb Wooler. Barb is a 1982 Grace alum and a career missionary. She served in the Central African Republic, where she led a ministry among the young people of the cities and villages to train workers to work with the Pygmy people. She is currently the first director of crisis response, developing and implementing this aspect of Encompass World Partners Ministry worldwide to those in need after crisis. She also writes about suffering and the human experience from a unique perspective, shaped by a lifelong love for God's Word. And because she has spent most of her life straddling two very diverse worlds, that of the Central African Republic and the U.S. She recently authored a devotional book, 30 Days to a More Resilient Faith. Barb, welcome to the podcast.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I'm glad you're able to join us, and I'd like to start by taking you back to those days at Grace College. And you were a transfer student,
yes,
if I remember correctly. Did you know even at that time that God was calling you into full-time ministry, into missionary work? How did that heart for missions develop?
Well, I transferred from another Christian university. And while I was there during my freshman year actually it was in April, I heard a missionary present about her ministry. And honestly, I don't know where she served, what she said, what kind of ministry she did. I don't remember what she looked. I don't remember anything about her, except that I left that session feeling like, wow, that'd be a great way to spend your life. Because that was actually something that was really a burden that I felt at that time when I was a senior in high school and then on to my freshman year of college. It's like I really wanted to use my life in a way that made a difference. And I didn't know what that was going to look like. So God used her. I've often thought I can't wait to get to heaven and meet her and tell her how God used her, whatever she said, or find out what she even did as a missionary. So by the time, so I went to my sophomore year, and God just propelled me out of that school, that university that I loved so much. And I came to Grace. I really felt like I was leaving the best university and I was going to hurt myself, but I had to leave. I won't go into what that was all about, but God pulled me to Grace, and within a month I was like, oh my goodness, this is a great place. And it was not a step backward in terms of my education, and it was not a step backward in terms of my being trained in the Word and exposed to missionaries and things like that. In fact, my first impression when I came here, was, dang, it's cold here. I was at Grace at the Alpha dorm.
Yes. Okay. Yep.
Pitt West.
Oh.
Okay, so I'm at my other school, and I'm like,
for the name of a dorm.
Exactly.
Pitt,
I was
right?
like,
yeah, that makes it real
I'm
attractive.
leaving this school, and I'm going up to this place in Indiana, and I'd never been in Indiana before, and going to this place. My dorm is going to be Pitt West. What is that? But my first impression here after getting adjusted to the cold is, it was amazing. I mean, in terms of my major, which at that time I was physical education, I decided not to change my major because I thought, education is awesome.
Sure.
And anything I do, I'm going to be teaching people. So I stayed with physical education. But in terms of my major, Grace was better than the place that I had left. And then in terms of like missions, exposure to great missionaries, at that time they were having, I think, Bible conference in this fall and missions in the spring, or vice versa, one or the other. So, I remember great speakers coming to Grace. I'm like, I believe Chuck Swindoll was here, John MacArthur. It was awesome. So Grace College was really important in my upbringing and my education, my training. When I ended up going to the field, the Lord.
And how soon after graduation did you go to the field?
Well, when I graduated, I was pretty sure I was going to, be a missionary.
Okay.
But I had to pay my school
Yes.
loans off. So that took me a couple years, and then I left in 1985. So, it was. So it was just a fantastic training at Grace, and then moving on to the mission field and doing a large diversity of kinds of ministries, which some of you've spoken about. I got such great training. Even my physical education training, the courses I was taking, thinking would not be helpful for me, kinesiology, the first aid stuff. All the stuff having to do with health and physical fitness and things like that, they actually ended up being really important because the Lord sent me to an unreached people group in the rainforest, the Pygmy people. And, initially they were coming to me and asking me about their health needs. And it's like, look, I'm not a doctor. I don't know. I'm not a doctor, so I wouldn't do anything. Then I saw what they were doing to themselves, like, yeah, I can do better than that. So with my training from Grace College and a book that I never went to the forest without my book called Where There Is No Doctor, we were able to do actually a lot of really, I hate to say it that way, the Lord did amazing healing through that book and, stuff like that.
So you went to the... Say that again, the
Pygmy people.
Okay. Yeah. In the Central African Republic, which, the Grace Brethren had some work going on there, but you went to an unreached people group. Was it a team that went, tell us how you go from the world of opportunities, right, literally, when you're thinking missions, to, CAR, to the jungles and the Pygmy people. How does it get focused in on that? And then what are those first steps towards going to an unreached people group?
Okay, well, don't let me get bogged down in any details. Okay, so
people love the details. I love the details.
So in 1984, I was almost done paying off my school debt and came out here to Grace to see a friend who was still in school. So while we were here, what was then Grace Brethren International Missions and now Compass World Partners, they had a missions event or something like that. So I attended it, and there's a missionary named Marvin Goodman that many people know. He's with the Lord now, passed away about 5 years ago, but a very tall man with this big lion voice, and he was presenting, among others. And he told of his experience of going into the rainforest, and he broke down, and this car broke down, and he had to stay with pygmies for 3 days, which is hilarious because the guy is 6'4", and, big man. But he came out of the forest with this huge burden for the Pygmy people. So he starts talking about that, and it's like, I wanted to do Bible translation among an unreached people group, and I was planning to go with Wycliffe, Bible translators. And when he talked about that, I was like, why wouldn't I just do that? Why wouldn't I just go with my own denomination? And so I was like, yeah, I'll do that. So that started. Anyway, it's there's a lot of stuff in there. Obviously, I'm not telling you, but because you're not interested. But the Lord opened the way for me to go to the Pygmy people. Initially, the board of Encompass said, I can't go because I'm by myself and I need partners. And so it's like, all right, well, I'll just do the next thing. The next thing for me was youth work. So I started working with young people. And it occurred to me as one time I was actually teaching a Bible study. I had written something up on the board, and young people were taking notes in their notebooks. And I'm looking over, I'm like, are you kidding me? This room is full of coworkers, potential coworkers. So I just said, hey, if any of you are interested in joining with me and doing a ministry team, to youth, just come to my house on Friday, September 8th, and at 3 o'clock. And so on Friday, 8 people showed up, which is perfect because there's room for 9 in a truck. So we ended up making a team called Friends of the Gospel, Les Compagnons de l'Évangile. And we started working in the city, but every month we would go down make forays into the forest area. And so long story short, through those young people, I was able to get to know people in the Pygmy region, and I joined with them. And I mean, never went anywhere by myself. People are like, oh, I just imagine you all by yourself going into the forest. And what did the Pygmies think when they first saw you? It wasn't like that. I mean, I was always with people who the Pygmies knew until I became the one that they knew. So, that's how it just kind of happened, one step after the other, and the Lord sent me to these beautiful people in the rainforest. Just people who I often say I feel sorry for them that God sent me because somebody else could have done so much better, but God did send me them, and I love them, and it was an incredible privilege to live with them and be the one to be able to teach them the gospel, starting with Genesis all the way through to the ascension of Christ. I mean, teaching people who don't know any of the stories. They don't know any of them. And you're telling them about Noah and the flood, and the one story that they were like, come on, Madam, really, that can't be true. It's the story of the Tower of Babel. I'm teaching about the Tower of Babel, and so I'm like, that tower was so tall. You see that tree over there? And they have really tall trees in the forest. See that tree over there? It was like way more than 5 times bigger than that. It's like, yeah, right. But it was just a privilege to get to love them and be part of their community and see them grow in the Lord. And now there's a church there, and I'm here and they're there.
How long did you live with the Pygmy people?
It's a little bit of a tricky answer because you could only work with them during dry season. So each year, 6 months. And so I was living in the Central African Republic for 10 years, and then each year I'd go down there during dry season.
Okay. And tell me, I want to get into your gospel presentation, but tell me a little bit just like accommodations. I mean, where'd you live? What did your accommodations look like?
Well, first of all, I lived in CAR for 10 years. After that, I ended up coming back to the States to work with my organization here for 6 months and then go back there for 6 months.
During
so
the
Pygmies didn't know where I went. So my accommodations, each year I would buy a new tent, and it was a tent that you could stand up in. And I would live in the tent, and the tropical the sun would just tear it to shreds. So it was just worthless by the end of the 6 months. So, so I lived in a tent, and very primitively. I mean, really, it is truly in the rainforest. No electricity, just batteries, and water I would bring in a 55-gallon drum. So, those were my accommodations. I would take food back with me. But the Pygmies were so happy. See, the thing you have to understand about the Pygmies is they are a slave class, and they are considered by many Central Africans as people are not even sure in the Central African Republic if Pygmies are really people. Maybe they're just animals. So it's that kind of oppressed people. So when I came back and they were my full focus and they were my love, that was, to them, it was, I mean, this has never happened before. So they really treated me really well. And initially they were bringing me food, which was, by and large, it was awesome. By and large. But there are some interesting local delicacies that I learned to appreciate to an extent.
What was your favorite interesting local delicacy?
Well, there's two. The one, of course, I went in the beginning of dry season, and that's when the grass is seeding and falling over. So they go out trapping, and they get this animal, and they were bringing me this stew. So they bring me this stew. I was like, this is really delicious. It really was. I said, wow, this is really good. What do you call this? And they said, Zozo, in their language. And, well, Zozo, and for me, didn't mean anything. I knew in Sango, but I didn't know in their language. So then they bring it another time. This is great. Is this that Zozo stuff? And you say, yeah, this is Zozo. So after about 2 weeks, I was sitting with my grandma in the forest, and Mama Agatha and her husband comes into the clearing, and he'd been out trapping, and he had these huge, huge rats that tied, the tails were tied and hanging over his shoulders. And I said, Mama Agatha, look at Kolitimo, look at what your husband just caught. What do you call them? She said, Zozo. Like, okay, I've been eating
rat stew.
But it actually is quite good. It's more like, it's not like rat like we think of it.
Yeah.
It's more like groundhog or something like that.
Wow.
So that was good. And the other one was, now I do not like fish. And so I was delighted that God sent me to the African rainforest where there aren't seas and oceans. But by golly, one time they came with a bowl full of these tiny little catfish. And so it's like, okay, I guess I got to eat this. So the thing I don't like about fish is you get bones stuck in your throat. Mm-hmm. So up until then, that had never happened. So I was eating it. It's like, daggone it, I got a bone stuck right in my throat. Fortunately, they only brought that a couple times. But, yeah.
Zozo. All right. Mm-hmm. So if you ever put Zozo on the invitation when I come over, I'll know what that is.
Right. Barbecued Zozo.
One of the things you're known for is walk through the Bible, and you talked about it, the Bible stories. But it's an unreached people group. You just can't go in, and you have to figure out a way to explain the gospel. And so you sort of invented a way to do that. Tell us a little bit about the way you were able to communicate the story of the Bible. Right,
and it really is important that people understand how to read. They know how to read because God revealed himself in the word, the written word. But even people who know how to read, they are still primary oral learners. And then there's other people who are older, and they're never going to learn to read. And even if they do know, they always default to the orality. So we came up with hand motions for each of the, it's kind of a walk through the Bible thing. I wish I had taken walk through the Bible because I'm sure it would have been better than what we came up with. But we came up with hand motions for each of the major events of the scriptures, like creation, fall into sin, the big flood, things like that. And maybe I just did, I don't know what walk through the Bible is because I didn't take it, but that's what we did. And so that was a really important part because that provides hooks for people to hang, their understanding of the scripture on. And because the story of the gospel is chronological, it starts with creation or at least, yeah. So, it provides a way to help them grasp the full study, the full story, redemptive story of the Bible.
After you were there for many years, then even going back and forth, war affected your ability to. So tell us a little bit about that transition time of war and you being in the middle of it and having to make eventually the decision, at least not to live there, and how that affected you. And then I'm interested to just know a little bit about like why war? Why is war so prevalent and lasting for decades in the CAR?
Well, I'll just say when I went to the Central African Republic in 1987, our country was called the Pearl of Africa, and it was the island of peace in a very tumultuous area. The reason it's tumultuous, the whys of war, I found out like 8 years ago. I was in Bangui, and I was invited to the ambassador's house for Thanksgiving. He had the ambassador from Congo there, and that Congo region. Well, Congo is continual war, even worse than our country. And so I said to her, do you think there'll ever be peace in Congo? And she said, let me tell you what we say about Congo. She says, when God created the earth, he saw Saudi Arabia, and he gave Saudi Arabia the gift of oil, and he saw this country and gave them the gift of that. And this area of the world got the gift of that. Then when he got to Congo, looked in his bag, he says, and dumped it all out. And she said that's why there will never be peace in this region, because there's just too many riches for people to fight over. And that was sobering. As poor as my country is, the Central African Republic, they are incredibly wealthy in natural resources, just in diamonds and gold and minerals that are used for computer chips and things like that. That's a good part of why wars come. So in 1996 and 97, there was a bad war. In 2002, a devastating war. Every time there's war, it just sets the country back decades. And then the worst one came in December 7th, 2013. I was there in Bangui, and we just woke up to bombs going off in the city, and you just see that it was very complex. But yeah, the war just set us back by decades, and now it continues. Bangui is kind of stable, but to leave the city is risky. And I mean, I just think about what I used to do when I first went there. I'd get in a truck and I'd drive 3 hours up to Yaluki to a conference. I'd come back the same night, arrive home at midnight. You would never do that now. So it's really bad in the Central African Republic, and it's really hurt. It's hurt the country. Maybe it's helped the church. I don't know.
That's one of the things, being at Grace College, we hear about the CAR quite often, and the fact that they have more churches, Grace Brethren churches, Charis Fellowship churches, than there are in the United States.
Like by a factor of many.
That's amazing.
A factor of 100. No, a factor of 10 at least.
Wow.
20, yeah.
So, I mean, why the proliferation of churches, and then why has war potentially, at least, allowed for the spread of the gospel?
Right. In some ways, it really does damage. When in Acts 9, when it talks about Paul, he was destroying the church. Saul was destroying the church, it says. So it really does do damage in many ways. When I think of all the material supplied that was, charts and literacy stuff and other things that are destroyed, and people lose so much. I mean, they have so little anyway, and then what they have, they end up losing. So it's very disastrous in that way. But it has a way of purifying. I mean, 1 Peter 1, 6 and 7, trial of your faith, it purifies and strengthens you and makes you more resilient. And so I was just actually 2 days ago with 2 leaders of the Central African Republic, and they said the churches are full. And that's great, because churches, I mean, they've always been way more than us. And it is 100 times. I had to do the math there. They have 100 times more churches than we do in North America.
Which is what, I mean, we have, say, 200-ish Charis churches.
I'm being generous. I'm saying almost 300 in North America.
So 3,000.
300,000.
Wow.
Wait a minute. Wait. Hold on. No, 30, but the number of people is 370,000 people that attend these churches. So it's a lot of people.
Wow.
It's the largest Protestant church or Christian church in denomination in the Central African Republic. Yeah. But yeah, it's disastrous. But in other ways, it winnows out those who are coming to show off their clothes, or I don't know. It's had a positive effect, I guess, in some ways. But having said that, we want better for them.
Sure. Yeah, when life is hard, you're grasping for security, and that can be found in Christ.
Right.
And yet, of course, still you want better for the people,
right?
And for the country as a whole. More recently, you've been serving at Encompass in a new role, Director of Crisis Response. What is that role, and sort of how did your life in the CAR prepare you for that role? Well,
that awful war that started in December 13, was my first project, because 6 months later, people had no food. 75% of the population of the Central African Republic are they're farmers. They do agriculture. And it was very dangerous to go out in the fields. I mean, literally, they'd be working out in the fields and rebels would come by, see them, and just start picking them off with their guns. So it was had a way of tampering down the desire to get out into the fields. And so in 2014, then I was asked by my agency, by Encompass World Partners, to do a project to raise food, seed, and farming implements for the people in the Central African Republic. And it was amazing. Over $700,000 were raised and sent over to the CAR, which we gave to the church there, and then they distributed it through their churches. And in that way, it strengthened the testimony of the church in communities and strengthened their ability then to share the gospel. So that's kind of the core of, you ask what we're doing in crisis response. It's basically that. We believe that only the church can provide care for the whole person, physical, emotional, and spiritual. And of course, many agencies can care for physical needs and some can care for emotional needs, but no one wants to deal with spiritual needs. And we all know that that's at the core of restoring people emotionally and in other ways as well. So we Encompass Crisis Response, we seek to come alongside the church and put stuff in their hands and train them. I'm going to the Bahamas the first week of November to train the workers in the Charis Church there to be able to mitigate trauma, because people are coming out of really bad areas to Nassau, where our churches are. Nassau was not hit bad. And so we're receiving people, they're living there, they're being fed there, and but they have terrible trauma. And so trying to train the local church to mitigate trauma, because we come in and we go out, our teams come in, our teams leave, but the church stays there long term. And so that's in a nutshell what we're trying to do in crisis response.
So your ministry has, gone from a very specific group of people to, a broader group of those in crisis, and then even expanded through your writing to really all of us who in some way, shape, or form go through suffering. And that's been the what you've written about, and answering some of those tough questions, which I'm going to pose to you.
Oh, no.
No, but I mean, as people of faith, we all go through, no, we can't compare our suffering necessarily to, needing food in the midst of starvation, or needing shelter in the midst of losing our home. But we go through periods of crisis, emotionally, physically, spiritually. And, why does God allow bad things to happen, and what is the good of that?
Right. Well, how much time? In a nutshell, this was not the world God created. He created a perfect world where there wasn't the pain and the suffering and the horrible things that we experience and the trauma. That wasn't part of the world that God created. Our planet became broken because of our sin, of, what Adam and Eve did in striking out on their own, basically, and defying what God said. Drew, I wish that I could, that you could be on the side of being able to share recent revelations or things that God has shared with you, but you've asked me, and so just in the last month or so, I've just been so impressed by the centrality of dependence on God to holiness. And without a strong sense of dependency on God, we will never be holy. And we are to be holy as God is holy. And through the things that we suffer, among the things that happen, the way that we're purified is all that cockiness and self-reliance kind of goes away, it evaporates. I mean, I hope it does anyway. And we realize our need for God, for our next breath, for our next day. And it's sad that it takes suffering and pain to bring us to that point. And so God, in his love and mercy and grace, he allows us to go through hard things that, I mean, he allows these things. He doesn't necessarily do them, and some of them are awful. They're evil. He hates them. But in the process of all of that, of living on this broken planet, God is drawing us to him and purifying our faith, and enhancing our sense of dependency on God. And I think that's a lot of what's happening. So the 30-day devotional, 30 Days to a More Resilient Faith, it's all about presenting really just that in a nutshell. It's 30 short devotionals that are teaching a biblical theology of suffering, something that I really think is drastically in need in these days in this church, in the church. Somehow, even though we all know we live on a broken planet and we know things are messed up, but somehow we're always surprised when bad things happen and wondering, if God loves us, why do we suffer? And so I think a biblical theology of suffering is really important for the church and to build resiliency. And that was the goal of the 30-day devotional. Part 1 I wrote, which is the 30 devotionals, 500 words, I think. And then the second part, Wayne Hanna, I don't know if you know Wayne.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I asked him to present his story because he's lived through since his 20s, and he's now, he's retired now. He's lived with severe Crohn's disease, and it's complicated every day of his life. And so he talks about, it kind of wraps muscle and flesh and bones around theology. So that's, we co-authored the book.
I've recently been reading the Beatitudes, and the first one, right?
Right.
The Jesus first sermon, the first words of his first sermon are, "Blessed are the poor in spirit."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he's talking to a bunch of people who are the outcast, sick, hungry, dispossessed,
right?
And telling them, "Hey, you're in a really good spot because you're at like the perfect spot to receive the kingdom of God if you're willing to humble yourself and recognize your need for God."
Right. You want to co-author a book with me?
Yeah.
Do the next one together. That's
you have
good.
now exhausted the extent of my understanding of the theology of suffering, but that's hard for. I mean, you have seen war, you have seen poverty. Who's it harder for? Those who are suffering and in poverty, or us Westerners who have it pretty good?
Right. Yeah. So you've probably heard of Voice of the Martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
Was founded by a man named Richard Warmbrand. And he wrote a book called Tortured for Christ, which everybody in this, if you grew up in the 70s and 80s, 60s and 70s, you probably read that book. He said, after spending time, he was years in prison, and then he got out and started this ministry and came to the United States of America many times. After being here for a little bit, he said, people in the West have the hardest form of persecution because of the abundance that you have. You're not tried. Anyway, the abundance that we enjoy here in the West and ease of living, relatively speaking, it's beguiling, and it can really work against us in our pursuit of Christ and holiness. So, yeah.
It's easier for a camel to get through that little end of a pin than it is sometimes for us who are healthy, wealthy, and have so much. So, hard question. And I've wondered. I had a friend once who would pray for suffering because suffering brought this recognition of the need for Jesus. I've never been there. That's not something I have done or desired. But there is this like juxtaposition of like suffering helps us recognize our need, and yet typically we try to avoid suffering and help others avoid suffering. There's almost a tension there in a way. How do you think about that?
Well, I don't know your friend. It'd be great to talk with him or her, because I appreciate where they're coming from. Where they're coming from is 1 Peter 1:6 and all the other passages about, the groaning, and Romans 8 and longing to be delivered, and that hyper sense of dependency on God can come more easily when you're suffering and things like that. I'm not the shepherd of my soul. I'm not the shepherd of my path. When the Lord loves us so much, and He will allow just the right suffering at just the right time for just the amount, that we can take, the measures in which we can take. I'm just going to leave that to the Lord. I'm not going to ask for suffering. It comes anyway. So I think that, but at the core of that is the idea that, when we're weak, then we're strong. I don't think Paul asked for the thorn in the flesh. I think he asks that it would be removed 3 times. But having said that, the benefits that that came to him because of his increased sense of dependence on God, that was well worth it. So I and you can probably relate to this too, but I've gone through really hard times, and then you come out of them and it's over, and there's a sense sometimes where, I've heard other people say this as well, where you're like, I don't want the pain, but man, I was like so conscious of my need for God, and I was just being held and carried. I had that sense of awareness more. So I can pine for that maybe, and wish for that and long for that, but I'll just let the shepherd of my soul determine when I.
Yeah, you don't want the pain, but the presence.
Whether
it is, after confessing sin, right, and the expression of like your guilt, and after that you feel the great presence of God. Yet I don't want to keep on sinning,
right.
And I don't want to go through suffering. But in that you feel the presence of God, and you feel His care for you in special ways, and.
That's what heaven's going to be. Heaven's going to be that beauty without we're just so messed up. We're just so messed up. And, when we get to heaven, we won't be the kind of people that once God blesses, then we feel cocky, and we're, that won't be we'll just be so free in heaven. It'll be so beautiful, and there won't be that tension.
I so appreciate and thank you for being willing to step into. I mean, it'd be much easier to write a health and wealth gospel sort of a message, and
there's plenty of
prosperity, and instead choosing, the path of writing about something difficult and hard, yet part of all of our human experience, and to write about it, to live it. I thank you so much for even being willing to share a little bit of your story. Where can people find the book, or find you if they're interested?
I think they're pretty much sold out, except for the ones that we scarfed up. So you can get it at www.encompasscrisisresponse.com/30 days.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good. And any place out there in the interwebs people can find you if they're interested?
Actually at that same website.
Okay.
encompasscrisisresponse.org. There's a contact us. I would welcome connecting with people. And that book is available. We're selling it in for small groups.
Okay.
So
great. Well, thank you so much for spending some time and talking to us about your life and your story.
Thank you, Drew. Wonderful.
Thanks also to all of you for listening to the Grace Story podcast. Music was written and produced by Dr. Wally Brath, Assistant Professor of Worship Arts at Grace College. And thanks to our co-producers, Andrew Palladino and Rick Neer. And if you can do us a huge favor and share, rate, and comment on this podcast wherever you retrieved it from, we'd be so grateful. Until next time, live your best grace story today.